Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Albert Arena, Director of the Waltham Museum, a museum whose collection is on the history of Waltham. As part of our program, we have 16 historical slideshows on Waltham, and the one we have for you today is the industrial fame of old Waltham. Now, many of you have heard of the past industries of Waltham, the cotton mill, the watch factory, the Metz company, and so forth. But we're going to approach it a different way in the slideshow. We're going to show how these companies branched out throughout Waltham, throughout Massachusetts, throughout the United States, and was a great influence on the industrial power of the United States today. Now, as you can see from our titled slide, it shows a small gear with Waltham in it, driving a larger gear with the United States and the world in it. And that's the story we're going to try to show, how the influence of Waltham's early industry played a most dominant role in the industry of the United States and in some ways the world. Now, up until after the Revolutionary War, Waltham was a farming community. The farms along Trapella Road and Lexington Street. And the farmers all met here at the first church at Piety Corner. And they were very happy, but unbeknownst to them, they had a natural resource in Waltham which will lure industry into Waltham. And that was the waterfall. Of course, it wasn't there after the Revolutionary War. Theodore Lyman put up the first waterfall in 1785. It was a wooden waterfall. It would last 50 years before this present waterfall was put in. And he harnessed the water power from this waterfall. And the person who used this water power was a paper maker named John Boys. He came in, and you can see on the left, right to the right of that tree on the left, you can see the water wheel, and you can see his paper mill on the left, and his home is on the right. And Charles River winds around through the center on into Boston. He called it Eden Vale. John Boise called it Eden Vale, and the saying means valley, and Vale meaning valley, and Eden meaning Garden of Eden. To him, this was his Garden of Eden in the valley. He was very happy. He was producing paper. There was a demand for paper at that time. Backing them up financially was Governor Gore further on down the river. But Governor Gore, some 6 years after John Boise started his paper mill, John Boise started in 1788, around 1796, Governor Gore, he put up another paper mill near the Watertown line, where he harnessed a smaller waterfall for his water power. And there wasn't a demand for that much paper, so John Boise sold out to a fellow named Douglas and got out of the business. One of John Boise's workers, a young man, 27-year-old man named Nathan Uphams, started a third paper mill up at Stony Brook. And this is a picture of it later on, but when it was Robert's paper mill. But at the turn of the century, from 1799 to 1800, there were 3 paper mills in Waltham, and they were producing too much paper for the demand. It's sort of like that in industries, as history shows, that when a new product comes out, a lot of companies get into it and they overdo it. They did that in electronics and transistors and so forth. So the 3 paper mills operated for a while. Here again, you see it's Robert's paper mill in 1835. And once again, it's Upham's paper mill turned into Robert's paper mill in 1835. And this view is of Robert's paper mill on South Street with the Nombiga Tower over on the right. But the other 2 paper mills, Boise's old paper mill and Gore's old paper mill, they eventually sold out to the Boston Manufacturing Company, a cotton mill. Because around the the early part of the 19th century, there was a demand for cloth, textiles, and it wasn't being produced fast enough. There were small shops around that did the weaving from yarn, as there were small shops in other aspects of industry, small blacksmith shops, small wagon shops, but there were no factories as such. And as the story goes, if you've seen a slideshow on the mill number 1, history of the Waltham Boston Manufacturing Company, Francis Cabot Lowell moved in 1813 and bought out the old John Boise paper mill because that was the largest waterfall in the greater Boston area. And eventually he'll buy out the Gore paper mill, as we'll see. And he put up his historical mill, which we've talked about before, the first factory in the United States, where raw cotton came in one end of the building and finished cloth went out the other. That was done for the first time in Waltham in 1813. It was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the United States, and this was a very historical site. It's now a National Historical Site. Now what you see here is an ad of the Boston Manufacturing Company around 1900. It's near the Moody Street Bridge. Commenced business 1813. They were making wide sheeting at that time, fine colored goods, satin serges, fine knit underwear. A.M. Goodale was the treasurer, and their office was at 50 State Street, Boston. You want to remember, as this Boston Manufacturing Company operates throughout over 100 years, their office always remained in Boston. And although this company will go out of business here in Waltham in 1930, the corporation kept going, and as far as I know, it's still going today. Here's a view of the Boston Manufacturing Company around 30 years ago, right at the same site where John Boise's paper mill is located. It's now senior citizen housing, and it's now Landry Park is in that area. It'd be nice if they had an indication of Eden Vale down there that showed that it was a very historical site from Eden Vale. Now, what we're going to try to tell in this slideshow is how these companies branched out throughout Waltham and then throughout Massachusetts and the world. Now, here's an example. In 1820, they buy out Gore's paper mill, and they start to branch off by putting up a bleachery and dye works a mile down the road from the cotton mill. And that's their first offshoot of the Boston Manufacturing Company. 2 years later, well, Francis Cabot Lowell had died in 1817, but Patrick Tracy Jackson was in charge now. 2 years later, their mill in downtown Waltham was over capacity. The waterfall couldn't handle all the expansion that they hadn't planned. So they bought some land off East Chelmsford in northern Massachusetts, and they expanded their operations to that area, which they quickly called Lowell after their founder, Francis Cabot Lowell. Now you see they've expanded twice. They've gone to the bleachery and they've gone to Lowell. And these plants are operating along with the Roberts paper mill further up the river near the western line. And there was also another expansion taking place across the river from the Boston Manufacturing Company. They helped Samuel Dana start the Newton Chemical Company. And right around where Pine Street is and Lowell Street is today, all that area was the Newton Chemical Company because it was owned by Newton up until 1849. So you can see the tentacles spreading out from the Boston Manufacturing Company, which is good because the Industrial Revolution meant the spread and an expansion and the progress of industry in the United States. Here's a view of the bleachery about 1825. By the way, approximately 90% of the slides in the show haven't been shown in other slideshows. Here's a view of the bleachery in around 1825, and the Charles River there is in the foreground. Now, getting back to the cotton mill in downtown Waltham, here we are in 1883. But you might notice the trestle on the right there and the waterfall. The thing I want to point out is around 1854, that area we know as the Embassy Theater and Cooper Street today. As you can see, there's a couple of smokestacks there. The Waltham Gas and Light Company put up their facilities there. They bought out portions of Newton Chemical, and they started providing gas for the homes and for industry. Their first customer was, of course, the Boston Manufacturing Company. And there was the Waltham Gas and Light Company in 1854. As time went on, 1883, they started to provide electricity, as electricity was invented, to homes and to the cotton mill. So it was the Waltham Gas and Light, but they became the Newton and Watertown Gas and Light. And then it became Boston Consolidated Gas and Edison Illuminating Company. They were all operating right there at that Embassy Park, what we know as the Embassy parking lot today, and the Cooper Street area. That was a very key point in all our industry in Waltham because they were providing the utilities for these industries. Now, eventually they split up. The Waltham Gas became Newton Gas and Boston Gas, and Edison Aluminum became Boston Edison. But they were actually generating electricity there until the early part of this century. Big steam engines were generating electricity. Eventually, the Boston Gas Company sold their facilities to Embassy Theater, but Edison still maintains a building down there, one of their old generating buildings, and they use it as a substation. But that's an interesting part of Waltham's industrial history. Now, to go along with this industry that's moving in, the gas line pipes have to be laid and so forth. A couple of foundries moved into Waltham. A fellow named Davis started a foundry on Felton Street. The foundry being the forged the pipes or the metal that's necessary to be machined and made into machinery parts, pipe parts. And later on, John Farnham joined up with Davis, and they moved their operations from Felton Street to Foundry Avenue, where Raytheon is today. And they operated up until 1930. They were operating from right before the Civil War to 1930. Another foundry moved in on Felton Street, and they were located at 7173 Felton Street, and they were a little bit different than the other foundry in that they specialized more in alloyed metals such as genuine Babbitt, composition, aluminum, bronze, brass, and so forth for the sophisticated industries that would be moving into Waltham. Now, before the Civil War, there were a couple other industries that joined the Roberts Paper Mill, the Waltham Cotton Mill, and the Bleachery, U.S., and the Chemical Company in South Waltham. Parmenta Crayon Company moved in. You've heard that story about the dentist who invented the crayon, Dr. Francis Field, and Zenas Parmenta, his son-in-law, started the crayon business right there at the west side of the Watertown branch of the tracks off of Pine Street. And that was another industry in Waltham. Now, we'll follow this through. Eventually, this company would expand so much that they'd move to Sandusky, Ohio. Now, don't forget, in this story we're trying to tell is how industry branched out from Waltham throughout the United States. And here's a good example right there, where this crayon company in 1902 moved to Sandusky, Ohio, and they're still operating out there under some conglomerate. Another one, well, this particular company didn't expand anywhere, but it's an interesting company. A.W. Jewell Company made weather vanes in Waltham. They first operated at the rear of Rumford Hall, our old city hall. In the back, there was the A.W. Jewell Weather Vane Company. And along with the Weather Vane Company there, an interesting point is that it used to be the old jailhouse for the town of Waltham. And when they left there and moved to Felton Street, and Rumford Hall was moved, they moved that jailhouse onto Hurd Street. and it's still there. This building is still there on Hurd Street. It's part of an area where Joe Adshade once had his an auto body repair shop. Here's some weather vanes that A.W. Jewell made, and later on it was Cushing White weather vane. They're great collector's items today by antique dealers. They go for hundreds of, or not hundreds of thousands, but $10,000. And they're very rare to find. You can see some at the Shelbourne Museum in Shelbourne, Mass. But go along with our industries. Of course, it was all horse and wagons at that time. There was no automobiles or bicycles. But there was Kerwin's Livery Stable, located across Main Street from the Waltham Common. And there was blacksmith shops throughout Waltham. Emerson Black Shop, and here's a group of men here that provided the shoeing horses that were necessary at that time. Get an idea of what it was like at the last part of the 19th century. Now, and these industries also needed lumber. And one of the suppliers of lumber was Buttrick Lumber Company, operated by Francis Buttrick, who was very generous to Waltham. He gave money for the Waltham Library when he died. And of course, Barker Lumber started up in the 1880s providing lumber for Waltham, and they went out of business about 5 or 6 years ago. Now that's the way it was up until the Civil War practically. That's what Waltham was like. And now another industry moves into Waltham. We all know what that is. The Waltham Watch Company moved in from Boston, from Roxbury. Now there's a connection between the Boston Manufacturing Company and the Waltham Watch Company in that when Aaron Dennison came to Waltham, he was unsuccessful in finding the location. He was on his way back and probably going to look for another city or a town to locate the watch factory when he ran into Samuel Emerson of the Boston Manufacturing Company, who told him about old Bemis Farm along the Charles River. And that's where he eventually went, to old Bemis Farm along the Charles River. That's where you know it today, Crescent Street. The thing is, they never used water power at the watch factory. They just used the steam engines because by 1854, when they moved in, steam engines had been perfected to the point where waterfalls were not needed. Now, this is an overview of the watch factory in 1865, right at the end of the Civil War. You notice there's no Prospect Street Bridge, there's no footbridge, and that's what it was like. And there we see it again in 1875. And while you're watching there now, this is an interesting company. As you remember, the Waltham Cotton Mill expanded because they wanted to expand. But the Waltham Watch Company wanted to expand in their own place, but they were susceptible to expansion, which they did not want, because over their 100-year career, men were always breaking away, starting different companies. And we'll start with 1862. Charles Mosley and Charles Vanderwaart broke away and went to Nashua, New Hampshire to start the Nashua Watch Company, but they were unsuccessful. And the watch factory managed to buy them out and bring them back to Waltham. But that didn't last too long. It was sort of like, they were like lambs trying to leave the flock, and the watch people were bringing them back in. 2 years later, in 1864, Charles Mosley leads Nathan Sherwood, and they go out to Elgin, Illinois. And this time they're too far away. And they start the Elgin Watch Company. Now this is a big, big branch of the story we're trying to tell, because they're setting up a whole sophisticated outfit halfway across the country in Illinois, where there were Indians out there at this time, 1864. And the Elgin, Illinois watch company will expand right alongside of the expansion of the Waltham Watch Company, almost reach the same status as the Waltham Watch Company. And they, in turn, will have the same problems of the Waltham Watch Company out there. Sophisticated technicians would be leaving their company and starting companies out in Illinois and Ohio. So you can see how the branches are spreading from the Waltham Watch Company. Now here's the Waltham Watch Company in 1883. You might notice the footbridge on the right. And also you might notice the building to the right of the footbridge That was the old United States Chemical Company, another industry of Waltham where kerosene was invented in 1855. Later became Peterson's Ice House and Reese Corporation. And we found a couple of old pictures of the insides of workings of the Waltham Watch Company. They're a little bit faded, but here's the wheel and pinion making room. Here's the pinion finishing room at the watch factory around 1880s. This was the customer service department of the Waltham Watch Company, where watches came back to be serviced. And as we see in our slide showing the Waltham Watch Company, they had a lot of outings. Here's an 1890 outing. Very successful and happy company. This is the finishing department outing. September 7th, Saturday, September 7, 1912. It was all men at this outing. This group of with musical instruments to the right. And if you look closely at them, they're all laughing. Probably they were given the signal, everybody laugh at once before the camera went off. So they had a lot of fun as well as doing a lot of work at the Waltham Watch Company. This is very interesting. Someone got a piece of cloth and did his needlework of the American Waltham Watch Company. Of course, it was first called the American Watch Company. Then it became the American Waltham Watch Company, and then the Waltham Watch Company. But some woman, assumingly, did a lot of work on this needlepoint. Here's a 1906 view of the Waltham Watch Company. You can see the Fitchburg Railroad tracks in the foreground. We're at the Mount Feek area where this picture was being taken. We're near the Riverside train tracks. Great Waltham Watch Company. Another interesting picture which we recently acquired. The MDC has always been in charge of the Charles River, but we've just learned that during World War I, they provided 10 officers to the Waltham Watch Company as security guards against sabotage. And right in the center, the man right in the center, is John Adshade. His son, Joe Adshade, donated this picture to the Waltham Museum. And Joe Adshade is a retired auto mechanic. There it is, the great piece of machinery made in Waltham over 100 years ago, an American Waltham watch. Many years ahead of its time, made by machines. That was the greatness of the company. You know, the Waltham Manufacturing Company, the Boston Manufacturing Company, Waltham Cotton Mill, started industry into the factory system. But 40 years later, along came the Aaron Dennison and his Waltham Watch Company and gave sophistication to factories, making precision parts to 10,000ths of an inch clearance on machines with interchangeable parts. Many years ahead of its time, and a lot of great engineers and designers and technicians came to Waltham to help in this great industry. But as you'll see, many of them broke away and started their own industries. But they did produce this great piece of equipment, the American Waltham watch. Here's a view in 1912 from the top of the Waltham Watch Company looking towards Prospect Street. This was the office section of the watch factory where the executives operated. As a matter of fact, here's the executive office when I.E. Bocher was the vice president and manager. They had a little conference there around 1940s. This is the grave of Dwayne Church, one of the great engineers and designers at the watch factory. He stayed with the company. He never left them. And when he died, he had himself buried in Mount Feek Cemetery right there as you go into Mount Feek, overlooking the Waltham Watch Factory. And if you go in there now, you'll see, of course, you'll see this grave near the Waltham Watch Company, right across the Charles. Once again, another Waltham watch. They made other similar equipment, like this speedometer on a 1937 Ford made by Waltham. Here's a beautiful picture, an aerial view of the Waltham Watch Company in 1938. And needless to say, everyone will recognize Nuttings on the Childs, which was burned down in 1961. And you can see Peterson's house, ice house, the remnants of it, there in the foreground by the tracks. It's now, it's Riverwalk Park today by the Prospect Street Bridge, 1938. There's the Waltham Watch Company in the 50s. You're standing on the Prospect Street Bridge. That's where they have the sign, the Waltham Watch Company, and the big clock up there that's gone. Now, they had a school there for a while teaching students the art of making watches, repairing watches. But an independent school also operated, the Waltham Horological School by Palmer and Swain, and they operated at 78 Crescent, which will eventually be near Alder and Adams Street, where Bird Precision Bearing Company is today. But they were training their men. Let's get back to the expansion of the men leaving the Waltham Watch Company. In 1872, Ambrose Webster led a group, John Whitcomb and others, and they started the American Watch Tool Company on Elm Street. And they made lathes. Lathe being well, you'll see what it is in a minute, but that's the basic piece of machinery in making watches. But it can be used in just about any machinist trade. But that's on Elm Street. And there is the Webster Whitcomb Watchmaker's Lathe with one pedestal holding it up. Very fine piece of equipment. And like I said, the American Watch Tool Company made this piece of equipment. You might notice Ambrose Webster and John Whitcomb. Streets in Waltham are named after most of these men we're talking about. There's the bench lathe. It's a little bit larger than the watchmaker's lathe, made by the American Watch Tool Company on Elm Street. Now, in 1916, the Metz Company takes over the American Watch Tool Company, but the poor Metz Company runs into problems at World War I because they had a German name and were forced to go out of business. We'll get to that a little bit later. But they held on to the American Watch Tool Company for 2 years, and they were forced to auction it off. And when they auctioned it off, 3 different companies expanded from the American Watch Tool Company as they bought off sections of their equipment, one of which was Fred Derbyshire, who bought out the lathe section of the American Watch Tool Company, and he operated Derbyshire lathes for many, many years. Matter of fact, he's still operating at Bear Hill Road, still putting out Derbyshire lathes up at Bear Hill Road. As you see, from one branch, we've expanded to another branch, the Derbyshire Lathe Company. Then there was the Wade Tool Company. He bought off a section of the American Watch Tool Company in 1918, and they operated on River Street, kind of River and Sion Street, up until recent years, and now there's a Dunkin' Donuts located in that area. There's a bench profiler made by Wade Tool Company. Most of these companies will diversify, not only make the standard lathe, they'll make different machine products. The Waltham Machine Works, although they were in operation since the 19th century, they bought off some of the sub-press dies from the American Watch Tool Company. And they operated over on High Street. Interesting, the owner of the Watch Tool Company, Waltham Machine Works, was Edmund Sanderson, a great historian for the city of Waltham. Matter of fact, we use his book, Sanderson's Industrial History, to get a lot of our information. Still another company, it wasn't exactly a machine company as such, but Charles Vanderwood was with Ambrose Webster, and he left the company and started the United States Watch Company on Charles Street. And they made watches for a while. Eventually it became Howard Clock Company. But Charles Vanderwood, once again, was one of those men that broke away First with the American Watch Tool Company, and then the United States Watch Factory. We have some pictures, give you an idea what the insides of the old U.S. Watch Factory looked like, and the E. Howard Watch Clock Company looked like. See all the pulleys. First they were operated by steam engines, and then they were operated by motors. That's what industry looked like at the turn of the century. Now here's another industry starting up in Waltham. Now from around 1880 to 1910, about 6 or 7 great industries are going to move into Waltham. They won't reach the peak of the Waltham Watch Company or the Boston Manufacturing Company, but they'll all be connected to this group in one way or another. First, Henry Richardson. Henry Richardson worked for the American Watch Tool Company and as a machinist. He broke away because he accidentally discovered how to make emery cloth and emery wheels, a related product in the machinist trade. Of course, you have to grind things and emery cloth them. And he started a company on Bacon Street called the Waltham Grinding Wheel Company. And that's a grinding wheel. Now all these companies, these 6 or 7 I'm going to be mentioning, they're all supplementing the Waltham Watch Company, the Bleachery, Roberts Paper Mill, and the Waltham Cotton Mill. And Waltham Emery Wheel Company on Bacon Street is one of them. There we see it, expanding, operating for over 100 years. There's a good aerial view of the Waltham Emery Wheel Company. You can see old Leary Field, old athletic field, the top right there off of Bacon Street. And they went out of business about 10 or 15 years ago. There's the Emery Wheel Company wagon for the 4th of July celebration. You can see they have some grinding stones in the back of their wagon. And like to go along with all these industries, automobiles have not been invented. Back in the 19th century, they needed wagons, and the Flagg Brother Wagon Company at the corner of Charles and Harvard Street made fine wagons from the 1880s to 1915, when buses and trucks came into use. Now getting back to the cotton mill just for a minute, one gentleman left the cotton mill. He was a machinist at the cotton mill. His name was John Stark, and he started another machine shop on Moody Street near Chestnut Street. And he made a whole line of tools, not only good watchmakers' tools and milling machines and so forth, but he made things such as furnaces for the industry, small forging furnaces. If you look close, you can see Stark Tool Company, Waltham, Mass. On this little furnace. He did more than that. Around 1880s, he got involved with making clocks, and he called his company the Waltham Clock Company. It was in the same building as the Stark Tool Company on Moody Street. And it irritated the Waltham Watch Company a little bit. So eventually the Waltham Watch Company bought out the Waltham Clock Company in 1922. And for 2 years, the Waltham Watch Company called themselves the Waltham Watch and Clock Company. Then they went back to the Waltham Watch Company. And they put out these fine clocks both when they were the Waltham Clock Company on Moody Street and at the Waltham Watch Company. Now, we're naming 7 or 8 big industries. Well, they employed about 300 or 400 people that came into Waltham between the 1880s and 1910s, which will become a real foundation for the Chamber of Commerce and the progress of industry in Waltham. Another one would be Judson L. Thompson. He came from New York. Now, he really didn't have a connection with the Waltham Watch Company and Mill, but they were coming to Waltham because they knew Waltham was loaded with technical people, good people who can run machines and so forth. And Judson L. Thompson located in the 1880s right along South Street, where the Roberts train station is today, with Roberts Brandeis train station. And they were making buckles at first, but they would later change to rivets. It's a related product. But Judson L. Thompson was well known in Waltham up to about 15 years ago. We have some pictures here. There's the Judson L. Thomas rivets. There's a view of the building, the railroad tracks. The factory was on the right and the office building was on the left. You can see a road winding around Old South Street to the north west there. There's another view of the Judson L. Thompson Company. I'd like to mention some people who worked there. There was, let's see, Ralph Webb worked there, a friend of mine, for 25 years. Charles Shakespeare worked there. Tom Taranto, a friend of mine, worked there for many years. Walter Erickson worked there. And probably the most famous person that worked there that everyone knows is Mayor Austin Rhodes of the 1960s, worked there as an executive. He became mayor of Waltham in the 70s. So a lot of people worked there at the Judson L. Thompson Company. In the when Judson L. Thompson left, the Bartell family was influential in running the company. William and Paul Bartells run the old Judson L. Thompson Company. Now, still another industry to move into. Well, this fella, he broke away from the Waltham Watch Company, Bliss C. Ames. And after locating various locations, he eventually settled down on Lexington Street. And B.C. Ames is still going on. And they made the B.C. Ames lathe, the watchmaker's lathe, the bench lathe, and a whole line of sophisticated products. The milling machines, the dial gauges, and they're still operating there on Lexington Street. Very successful company. One person you'd all remember who worked there, Joseph Nipamara, who was famous in baseball in Waltham, worked there for many years. All right, here's another company moving in around 1902. Like the others, they go to various locations before they settle down. W.H. Nichols and his brother came down from Canada. Once again, they came to Waltham because of the technicians who were down here. And they had a small shop on Spruce Street, and then they settled down behind Cronin's. There's a picture they're taking behind Cronin's. Then around 1914, they moved to their present location on Ward Avenue. Notice that he's always around the watch factory. There he is, the Nichols Company off of Ward Avenue, which is on the left. Also, the Mica Company was another company that moved in, which is south of Nichols Company, right by the Ward Avenue Bridge. You might notice the roof of Nichols. Now, the roof was similar to that on the old American Watch Tool Company. They were all using Metz's sawtooth roof standard, but Metz used for his sawtooth building. Since Metz owned the American Watch Tool Company, there's a section of that old company that had sawtooth roof, and Nichols did the same thing with his building. Now, some of the people we know that worked at Nichols was, well, first of all, John C. Robbins, the old manager of the Metz Company, got a job here when the Metz Company went out of business. We know Ken Burgess, who worked here at the Nichols Company. And, of course, there was William Hart. Nichols started the company, and his sons, William Hart Jr. and Arthur Nichols, continued it on. And let's see what the products they were making. Well, they got a little bit off from the standard machine shop products, and they made these Gerodas. They're hydraulic. They're not hydraulic, but they pump. They're pumps, lube oil pumps for aircraft. There's a view of them on 48 Ward Avenue. Now, if you look, I don't know if you'll be able to see it in the slide, but on the right you see that this particular company, for a while, they were expanding to places such as Cranston, Rhode Island, Portland, Maine, Gloucester, Mass, South Portland, Maine, and in Wisconsin. So their technology was being spread throughout the United States. the Nichols company has now merged with another company, but they're still producing these Gerodas, and they're also producing Zenith metering pumps for the industry. And still again, once again, there's Nichols company on the right in the 1930s when the Waltham Canoe Club was on the left and Arnold's Boathouse is on the left, right at the Charles River. These are all solid companies employing 300 or 400 people, backing up the Waltham Watch Company and the Waltham Cotton Mill at the late part of the 19th century and the first 40 or 50 years of the 20th century. Now, to go over this again, this is an example of the technology coming from the Waltham Watch Company. It's an exhibit at the Waltham Watch Company, the Waltham Museum. It's a drop wire machine. Now, this was made in 1915 by another machine shop. We're not mentioning them all, there's so many of them. Dunbrack Tool and Die. Now, I don't want to say old man Dunbrack, but Harry Dunbrack left the Waltham Watch Company at the early part of the century, and he taught his sons the machinist trade. And one of the products they made was this drop wire machine, and they just so happened they made it for the Boston Manufacturing Company, Waltham's cotton mill. So there's a tie between the two companies. And this is a drop wire machine, a drop wire being an object that will separate the threads in the loom, and if one of the threads breaks, it shuts down the looms. But the drop wires were made on this machine, and the technology of a watch is in there, in that there's levers and springs and cams and counterweights and all the things that go into a proper machine. But there's the technology spreading right here in Waltham, and you can see it at the Waltham Museum. There was Camp watchmakers' lathes. There was W.D. Clements, who made parts of watchmakers' lathes. Then there was another company that started up at 199 Charles Street at first. It was Waltham Screw Company, and it was started up by Ed Foss, who came from the watch factory, and it was also started up by Charles Vanderward's son. See, Charles Vanderward was the original designer of the watch, the machine that made the small screws at the watch factory. And his son took this idea of making these small screws and started his own company, the Waltham Screw Company, which was at first at 199 Charles Street. It just so happens that the Waltham Museum's at 196 Charles Street, and this company started directly across the street from 196 Charles Street. And to help them along was Daniel Viles. Daniel Viles being one of the financial backers, and he will eventually operate the company as they move to 80 Rumford Avenue. But Viles Court, where the museum is located, was right across the street from their original location at 199 Charles Street. This picture shows the screw machines at the old watch factory, which is an idea of what the inside of that company looked like, because we don't have any pictures of the Waltham Screw Company. But that was another one of the big companies, not the 300 or 400 employee company that were the backbone of Waltham for some 50 or 60 years. Another one was the Potter Press. Right there, the Potter Press was right there next to J.L. Thompson. Now, the reason I have the sports picture in here, because all these factories during the 20s and 30s would have a baseball league. The Potter Press would play J.L. Thompson's, would play W.H. Nichols or B.C. Ames, or some other similar team. And it was very interesting how everything was going so smoothly during the 20s and 30s. Even during the rough Depression, they managed to survive and enjoy themselves through the Depression during those hard times. Now, in amongst all this industry going on, John Lally came from Ireland and started the John Lally column company because he invented the Lally column. As you recall, homes were held up by wooden posts, but he thought of the idea of putting concrete into a pipe, probably a pipe forged at the Davison Farnham Foundry. And as you see down there at the bottom right, his office and factory at Waltham, Mass. He had New York office at 87 Postal Building and the sales office at 65 Federal Street in Boston. Here, once again, is another advertisement for the John Lally column. His office and factory was at the Beaver Brook Station, Waltham, Mass., 65 Federal Street. And his office was at 65 Federal Street, something like the Boston Manufacturing Company. His factory was here, but his office was in Boston. Now, around 1902, they'd take the same route that the old crayon company took. They'd move to, first they moved to Cambridge, and then they'd move out to the Midwest. And the Lally column would become part of a conglomerate out there. Once again, the branch of Waltham's industry is spreading. And in this particular case, it's the Lally Column Company, and they're still making them out there under some conglomerate. There's a bill from the Lally Column Company. Now, right there amongst, well, all these businesses are booming in Waltham. Around 1883, bicycle was sweeping the country, and no more so than right here in Waltham. And this fellow, William Shakespeare, came to Waltham. He owned a piece of property off South Street, Shakespeare Road. He tried to make bicycles, but he was unsuccessful. But he wound up working at the watch factory as a damaskier. It's one of those men who made those intricate carvings in the back of a watch. And there was William Shakespeare, who Shakespeare Road was named after. Now here's his son, Charles Shakespeare. He has a bike because Charles Shakespeare worked for almost 50 years at the J.L. Thompson Company. He used to ride that bike from his home at Shakespeare Road to the J.L. Thompson Company. And as I said before, his son-in-law, Ralph Webb, also worked at the J.L. Thompson Company. But Charles Metz was successful in the bicycle business. It was a real perfect place for him to come, right amongst all this industry, that he located his bicycle factory on Rumford Avenue, because not only were all these industries available to him, and the technology, but Bicycle Park was available to him. And he got together with the Howe brothers. They're shown here, the Elmer Howe's on the right, just before that post on the right, and his brother is sitting fourth to the left of him. But the Howe brothers break away from him and started the Comet Bicycle Company on High Street, where the old Mass Hardware warehouse is. And the Comet people made Comet bicycles, and they tried to make Comet steam buggies. But they were unsuccessful and out of business. However, they did help make parts for the first Stanley steamer, and unfortunately they had to go out of business. The Waltham Museum is proud because we have one of the Comet bicycles, probably the only Comet bicycle in existence. But that was an interesting part of the company. But the Orient Bicycle and Metz kept going good. Here we see their advertising parade in New York. He was a good promoter, Charles Metz. Here's a rare picture of the 10-seater bike we've talked about in the past. The only one we believe that's ever been in motion. The 10-seater Ori 10. We believe it could be Bicycle Park. And he went to motorcycles. This particular Orient motorcycle is owned by someone in Michigan, and they're willing to sell it to us if we want to buy it. We're thinking of buying it. Then they went to tricycles, motorized tricycles. Here we see Albert Champion, who later invented the Champion spark plug, working for the Metz Company as one of their races. Then they go to four-wheeled vehicles, which is an extension of that three-wheel vehicle. Autogos, they called them. Then they go to Orient runabouts. Once again, there's collectors of these throughout the United States, and they're corresponding with the Waltham Museum. And this fellow owns this Orient runabout, 1902 Orient runabout, amongst his wide collection of antique cars. But the Orient buckboard, made by the same company, was the successful automobile produced at that company in Waltham. There's another view you've never seen before of the Orient buckboard. And they made a line of other vehicles, the Orient Waltham Parcel Public Service Car. Then the Waltham Manufacturing Company, maker of the Orients, was taken over by Metz. He changed the name to the Metz Company, and the first car he produced was the planned car, the car put together by kits. And here's the two-cylinder planned car made by the Metz Company. In our story, the slideshow on the Metz Company, we go into detail on all these cars. Here's the two-cylinder Metz engine on the Metz planned car. Recently, Automobile Quarterly, a very fashionable antique automobile magazine in the United States, had a 16-page story on the Metz Company. If you get a chance, you ought to get the copy of it. Here's a beautiful 1913 Metz Roadster. Once again, 1915 Metz. There's the details of the steering gear of a Metz car, and the gear, the larger gear, indicates the RPMs of the car. The four-cylinder engine, water-cooled engine of the Metz car. Now, they had friction drive on a Metz car, and this is notice the gears on the top of the two pedals on the left. The pedal on the right is the brake. The two pedals on the left operated the friction drive, where you'd position the wheel either in the center for neutral, or you'd put it to the one way to go ahead and one in the opposite way to go in the opposite direction. But the notice there says, do not push it in too hard, or you'll wear out the friction drive too readily. But they'd position these pedals at a certain position, and they'd drive their car along. Nice looking Metz car, 1915, early 1915. 1916, they went to parcel cars. And then you've heard the story that having a German name that killed him during World War II. But 1922, they changed the name to the Waltham car. Here's a rear view of a Waltham car. I do want to say he was very popular with all the industries. In 1916, Charles Metz, along with the owners of Nichols and J.L. Thompson's and B.C. Ames, they formed the Chamber of Commerce in Waltham, an extension of the old Board of Trade organization, 1916, 1917. And the group went along very well, except for the Metz Company, because when they went out of business in 1922, the Metz Company moved to California and started a new life out there. Here's an aerial view of the Metz Company off of Rumford Avenue, where you can see Waltham Screw Company, and there was also O'Hara Watch Dial Company on the left, which made dials for the watch industry. In 1970, when the Metz Company was then the Perrine Battery, it burnt down, this Perrine Battery, one of Waltham's greatest fires. That was a picture of it. Some other automobile-connected industries from Waltham. The Doble brothers started making steam cars here in 1911, but they moved to Detroit and then California and then throughout Europe, making steam cars, steam trolleys, steamboats, and everything else, but they started here in Waltham. Then there was an extension of the Metz Company, was the chief draftsman of the Metz Company got together with Francis Davis, and they designed power steering in Waltham. And they brought their invention, the power steering invention, to Detroit in the 1920s to try to sell their power steering invention to the automobile industry. But the automobile industry tried to design around it, and they never bought power steering from Francis Davis. And George, I forget his last name now, George, but anyway, Francis Davis managed to stay in business for many years, and the automobile industries kept trying to design around it, but there were a lot of court cases involved between Francis Davis and the automobile industries. And eventually, when the patent ran out in the 1950s, the automobile industry used his designs without giving them any royalties on all their cars in the 1950s. So it's sort of, in a way, it was a rough business out there, being in business, in the industrial business. Now here's some pictures with people have donated. They said they were in Waltham, but we don't know exactly where they were. But it gives you the idea of what it was like in these factories at J.O. Thompson's, Waltham Grinding Wheel, so forth, what the train stations were like. Now in 1930, the Mets went out in 1922, but then, unfortunately, the Waltham Manufacturing Company, the cotton mill, went out in 1930. But the strong Chamber of Commerce replaced the Waltham cotton mill with some 33 diversified industries, and such as Studios Incorporated in the old number 10 building. And there was also Atlantic Registry they got in there, and Puritan Dress and Sterling Insulation. So they always managed to keep businesses in this building. Although, like I said, now this company went out of business, but the main company kept going. It's still going today out of Boston or wherever they're located today. A couple other industries came to Waltham. Clifford Manufacturing Company came, and they changed the Standard Thompson in 1947, and they made thermostats. Then Reese Corporation came in 1947, located where old Peterson's Ice House was. The watch factory went out in the 1950s, but it became Waltham Precision Instrument Company, and industries moved into the watch factory, such as Cleveite, and even Raytheon was in there for a while. Then Raytheon, of course, came into Waltham in the 1930s, and there's the Raytheon building. And once again, a whole great deal of technology was brought to the city of Waltham to supplement what was always here, led by Vanderveer Bush and his machine he's designed for differential equations. There was the Acme transformer. Raytheon tubes, of course, was their main product, which brought them to Raytheon radar. And after the war, of course, there was Raytheon television. And they bought out the old Mets building, which used to be the Lever building or the Buick building. But they're still operating the old Mets building, Sawtooth building. They're off Sion Street. There's an aerial view of the Raytheon location where the bleachery was located on the right. Davison Final Foundry, which is now Standard Thompson, on the left. It used to be the Howell Button Factory was located there also. That was another industry in Waltham's past. Here's an aerial view of that same location. Raytheon continued on making Sparrow missiles for the war effort and Hawk missiles. And then Route 128 went in to take the place of Waltham Watch Company. And a whole batch of other companies came to Waltham, such as Sanborn Company and Baldwin Lima Hamilton and Polaroid and Donnelly Manufacturing Company and Tracer Lab and Graphic Microfilm and Mutual Boiler and Machinery came, and a whole host of new industries came to Waltham, all because of old Eden Vale, way back in between the 17th century, 18th century and 19th century. Here's an aerial view of Route 128 today, with all this progress, although there's been a slowdown in recent years. And finally, the final picture, we go back to our two basic industries. You notice the Waltham Cotton Mill, could say it's the grandfather of all industry in the United States, and the Waltham Watch Company, you could say, is the mother of all industries in the United States today. And this concludes the industrial fame of old Waltham. I want to thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and good day.